as you know, I recently participated on Jubilee's newest episode of their Surrounded series, One Atheist versus 25 Christians. And of course, it was none other than Alex O'Connor, and him and I faced off on an awesome segment of the problem of evil. I first want to say that my experience on the Jubilee platform was awesome, and it was fun, and they took care of us really, really well. And debating Alex was great. So many comments on either Jubilee's TikTok video or on some of my other videos on my platform have all said a resounding, respectful conversation was appreciated. Prior to actually having it be revealed that we were debating Alex, we kind of had an idea that it was probably going to be him. And I already knew from some of his past discussions that he was already talking about the problem of animal suffering, which is actually a problem I've been investigating for the last 5 years. If you've seen any other videos on my channel, you know that I've actually come to my own response, and I think that I've come to a satisfactory response that not only reconciles the existence of horrendous animal suffering with the existence of the Christian God, but actually positively supports it. Now, I'm not going to be able to make a case in this video for that, and that is not my intention, but rather I want to show you exactly where the conversation was going and what you should be thinking at these particular pivotal moments of our interaction.
You heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem? I have not. Okay, so
this one ended up getting a lot of laughs. The first is the axiological expectation mismatch problem. Nagasawa actually maintains in this book that the problem of evil is actually a more of a byproduct of something more fundamental, something more basic, and that is called the axiological expectation mismatch problem. He has a whole chapter dedicated to outlining what this problem is, how to motivate that this is actually where the problem of evil comes from, and then how to understand it in the various ways in which the problem of evil is actually articulated. And it's really a conflict between two propositions that someone in their worldview could hold. One, their worldview gives them a expectation of the way things are supposed to be. So the world is supposed to contain some property P. And then we observe, and our observations tell us that the world lacks this property P. Thus, there is a misalignment or a mismatch between what we originally expected and what we observe. This is axiological because it has to do with our value-oriented or value-laden expectations. For example, when it comes to the existence of God, it seems that traditional theists would be saddled with a being that is perfectly loving, has all power and all knowledge. And so an expectation that one can adopt, and atheist philosophers such as J.L. Mackie have famously adopted, that God would desire for there to be no suffering. So we can expect no suffering. Oh, but our world actually does contain suffering. And if we want to put this in a valid logical structure of modus tollens, we can put it this way. If God exists, then plausibly is expected that there will be no suffering. There is suffering. Therefore, plausibly, God does not exist. When we use the word expected, this is an evidential term that is then not, it's actually evidence against the existence of God. And this is actually where most atheist philosophers go when they are advancing an argument from evil. Notice, however, that the expectation is baked into the first premise. That is expected plausibly that if God exists, there will be no suffering. I wanted Alex to understand that the nature of our conversation is actually an internal critique, that given the constraints of my worldview and thinking within the confines of the logic of my worldview, there has to be two propositions that I can't actually hold and believe simultaneously. And if Alex can't successfully show that my worldview has that conflict, then the problem of evil doesn't even lift off the ground. It is a non-starter. Thus is one less reason for Alex to disbelieve in the existence of God. Many people ask me, Tim, what is the rub here? Why is Alex so obsessed with the well-being of these animals? And the question is very easily answerable. Theism has what are called theodicies, and these are explanations, divine explanations of why there is evil or why God did not prevent certain evil. And a traditional response is called the soul-building theodicy, which merely states that suffering is actually instrumental towards our moral growth, in our perfection. If we want to grow in love and compassion and forgiveness and in self-sacrifice, there has to be significant trials and suffering. So the suffering exists to grow us and to mature us and to refine us into stronger and more resilient and more morally mature individuals. However, a precondition for any of that is higher order consciousness, such as the feature and the ability to do meaning making. Animals lack this higher order cognitive capacity to be able to make grand narratives or meanings out of their experiences. And so they're just left with the kinds of suffering that we go through, but without the mechanism by which they can do something like soul build. And not only that, we observe many animals dying in agonizing pain, tragic deaths, where there is no period of recovery for that animal between its death and the suffering that befell it. Plausibly, the theist cannot use a soul-building response as a reason why God did not prevent the suffering.
Prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection, such that it relies upon things like predation and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does a select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according to a certain way.
This gets into this next part, which is setting up the system. This is where I pushed back on Alex, and again, I wish that I would have used maybe even different language to articulate this. But when I say that God does not create worlds, what I'm saying is that God does not look out into the vast possibilities of all that could exist and then arranges the ones that he likes into a nice and neat world and then actualizes that package, where he reaches out into the depths or the annals of time, tinkers and picks and chooses where he wants things to line up, and then just lets it play out. I don't believe in that pick and choosing, tinkering, deterministic, world creation model. What I'm disagreeing with Alex here is what is called the disjunctive versus conjunctive model of creation. The disjunctive model of creation is originally defended in a paper by the philosopher Peter van Inwagen, who is Christian himself, in a paper titled The Place of Chance in a World Sustained by God, where Peter van Inwagen defends the thesis that God actually just creates the initial world segment with the initial conditions to unfold according to a general governed plan that God has in mind, and is imbued with an ingredient of chance, where as chances play out differently, interesting and diverse states of affairs eventually evolve over time. But it's within these terms and conditions that God's already set up from the beginning. So God doesn't need to pick and choose and place and arrange things in a particular manner on the later than edge of the universe. Think about it this way. God wanted there to be humans. Now, if you believe that God said, let there be carbon-based Homo sapiens, if you believe that that's what God said to get humans, then you believe in more of this conjunctive model where God already saw everything and is packaging everything together specifically in how it's supposed to go. Or you can take the disjunctive model view, which says that God says, let there eventually be embodied moral agents, and we eventually come about. And this just happens to be the way in which we exist as embodied moral agents. So on this view, the universe then co-participates in the creation of the rest of the world. So God then uses mediating causes to bring about his total end goals. So it just happens to be, because chances play out differently, that there is a system of nature where predation and animals struggling for survival of limited resources takes place in our universe. The real question then comes down to, can God still achieve his plan through this chancy process, even though in some of the portions of the universe's timeline, there are things that God would not approve of? And what I wanted to address and really make clear to Alex is yes. This next part is where Alex does this little tricky philosophical sleight of hand. And if you haven't watched my video on avoiding this number one mistake people make when responding to the problem of evil, watch that, but I'll explain it here.
Can we talk about that claim? Because these animals are suffering for what? I mean, God might cause them to suffer a bunch.
Alex confuses what is called moral justification with psychological motivation. When we ask the question, why are you morally justified in doing some action? Let's say you see me partaking and consuming coffee. I really like coffee, okay? I can actually give you my psychological motivations for why I'm drinking coffee. I like the caffeine, I like the taste, right? It's a habit that I have, and this is an explanation of why I'm drinking coffee in terms of my desires, intentions, and beliefs about coffee. But that doesn't settle the question of if I'm morally justified in drinking coffee. So what is exactly the answer to that question? Well, ultimately, the only answer to that is, if I am not being unethical by drinking coffee, then I am presumably morally justified in drinking coffee. How would we show that I'm not unethical by drinking coffee? Well, we would have to appeal to some ethical framework that would allow us to identify what actions are actually wrong making versus ones that are actually permissible or okay or even right making. So when you ask the question, why did God allow there to be this kind of suffering? That's a moral justification question. When you ask, why did God create a world where there is a system that ends up bringing about this kind of suffering? That is a question about God's psychological motivations. And here's the kicker. If you deal with the former, which is moral justification, that is what ultimately neutralizes and blunts any of the force from a problem of evil actually occurring. And it renders the latter uninteresting. The problem of evil only arises if you are actually able to identify instances of unjustified suffering. But here, if we can show that God is not bad in not preventing some instance of suffering, then there is no problem to be identified. In this section, Alex actually ignores my reference to the animal's post-mortem existence, where they have an opportunity to have their lives redeemed, where he focuses on their earthly life and a story where the deer actually just dies. I think this obfuscated the point I was originally making. Prior to this, I already mentioned that it's going to include their earthly life and their afterlife. And I wish at this portion of the conversation, I would have brought us back to that and not let this part run on, because it's a little bit red herring and doesn't actually address the actual stance that I hold, which necessitates the afterlife portion of the well-being of a creature's existence. I gave Alex a softball here. I didn't ask this question because I'm unfamiliar with what he means by necessary for or is it justified. It's because I understand that philosophers, atheist philosophers, use this necessity condition to motivate the idea that, hey, this is plausibly unjustified suffering. In William Rowe's famous paper, he argues that a justified evil, one that is necessary, is one that is necessary for the bringing about of a greater good or the prevention of a greater evil. Now, I'm making Alex's job easy for him. All he has to do is adopt these norms, and I can give him a different set of norms that don't abide by that stricture. However, Alex equates evils being justified with their being necessary. And this is where I push him and say, hey, I don't know why I'm obligated to adopt a necessity condition. I take Roderick Chisholm's view that he outlines in his original paper, The Defeat of Good and Evil, where evil is not something that is necessary for either the greater good or prevention of a greater evil, but rather in its ability to be defeated in an individual's life. Defeat is akin to this psychological retroactive consent to the particular life history that a creature has lived out, and where the suffering remains bad in its own right, but becomes an integral part of their life actually being good on the whole. Where this creature has to subjectively come to the conclusion that their life was worth living and that they do not wish away or regret the suffering that they went through, thus leaving no negative lasting impact of such suffering. That means that for animals that never experience it in this life, it necessarily results in them experiencing it in their afterlife. So to respond correctly to my position, you have to incorporate the afterlife aspect. So there are two views on the table, one put forth by John Schneider and the other Trent Doherty. Both advocate for animal afterlives and animal universalism. John Schneider maintains that animals will receive this praiseworthy elevated status in the afterlife, where they will be praised and bestowed goods for the role and the lives that they lived in creation. They will be able to emotionally resonate with the love that is being bestowed upon them and thus defeat their suffering. The second view is a little bit more controversial, and that is the actual resurrection of animals to a higher state of consciousness like that of humans, where they can access meaning-making resources like we can to be able to soul build and defeat their sufferings. I think both of these views are very valid ways to approach the mechanics of how the defeat of evils will take place in the afterlife, and there are arguments for both. Ultimately, I was unable to discuss these versions of how to approach the ultimate redemption of animals, and I look forward to maybe the day in which Alex and I can actually discuss that together. But this is my full recap of how the things went down. I really enjoyed my time, and I hope that this might have cleared things up for you, or at least provided clarity in the available approaches to addressing the problem of animal suffering.